Welcome to the New Mexico News Podcast, headlines and stories from the land of enchantment. Brought to you by KRQE. Here's Chris McKee and Gabrielle Burkhart.
We all know New Mexico has a lot of beautiful wilderness areas and different landscapes depending on where you are in the state. And it can get really different depending on where you are in the state, also to say. There's a lot of rich history in those different places as well. And the place in New Mexico that we're talking about today, they're celebrating a major birthday this month. It's a centennial, so that is 100 years, and we're talking about the Gila Wilderness.
Yeah, the Gila is in southwestern New Mexico, kind of near Silver City, and on June 3rd, 1924, the U.S. government designated 755,000 acres as a wilderness area. It was the world's first designated wilderness area, and now it's celebrating its 100th anniversary. So let's get straight to our guest who's joining us remotely from Silver City. This is Luke Koenig, a Gila Grassroots Organizer for New Mexico Wild. Luke, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
So first, Luke, what is your role with NM Wild and what's your connection to the Gila Wilderness?
Yes, so I am the Gila Grassroots Organizer. And my connection to the Gila, I think, is something that spans multiple levels. It's professional. For my job, I seek protections for the Gila. I work directly with communities to try to better protect this place and ensure that we have something to enjoy and celebrate 100 years from now. And it's also personal. I spend as much time as I possibly can in the Gila Wilderness, whether that's backpacking, fly fishing, or just simply, getting away from the hustle and bustle of town. It's a place where I go to relax and reflect and regroup and recenter myself.
So I have to say, personally, I have never been out to the Gila, so that's part of why I think this is an interesting conversation for me. It's a chance to learn a little bit more about it, but I do have some kind of nexuses with it, just having to do a few stories out in Silver City in my years past here, and then also went out to Mogollon once to do a story after that small community flooded. I think it was in 2014 is when maybe those floods happened. It's 13 or 14, but point being, I just know from my very brief little interactions that I've had, it's a really unique place in New Mexico, and it looks really different than, say, for a lot of us who spend a lot of time in central New Mexico. For those who haven't been to the Gila, would you describe it for us? What makes this particular wilderness area unique?
That's a great question. I think there are a lot of different things that make the Gila unique. So the Gila is comprised of a number of mountain ranges, kind of all stacked up on top of each other. These mountains were formed by violent volcanic activity many millions of years ago. They are primarily formed of rhyolite, of petrified ash from this really, really cataclysmic volcanic activity in the past. And they're a little bit distinct from some of the other mountain ranges nearby. And they've been downcut over the years by all these different rivers and streams that come together to form the Gila River. So the Gila River is actually the farthest south snow-fed river in the lower 48 states, which is really unique. So the higher reaches of the Gila are actually very high elevation and very cold, particularly for this latitude. So we're just a stone's throw from Mexico, and we have species like prickly pear cacti, we have javelina, we have these really kind of quintessential low desert, really heat-adapted species. And then you might look across the creek or uphill, and you'll see species like Douglas fir and Engelmann spruce, these iconic species of the northern Rockies that you can find well into Canada. So it's this remarkable confluence of ecosystems where you have quintessential, northern Rocky species, classic desert species right on top of each other. You have a snow-fed river that flows into the Sonoran Desert below. It's this remarkable place where the Sonoran Desert meets the Chihuahuan Desert, and where the Sierra Madre ecosystem from Mexico kind of runs up against the Rockies in the United States. and they all kind of meet right here. So it's extraordinarily biodiverse. I was actually just hiking yesterday, and I was hiking through this remarkable old-growth Douglas fir forest. And I just was reflecting while I was out there how incredibly lucky we are to have this forest type, which, we can associate with, perhaps the forests or mountains of Montana, just a stone's throw from Mexico, this far south because of the elevation. And that's just really unique and really spectacular.
And one more question to ask you, you're in Silver City. For those of us, I think we probably have a lot of listeners that are kind of in more of the metro areas and the cities. But being in Silver City, you're just like minutes away from going into these areas, right? Can you just tell me how close is this? How this is like your backyard?
Yeah, it really is like my backyard. There are a number of different kind of portals, if you will, to enter the Gila Wilderness and to enter the forest more broadly. So just back up a little bit. So the Gila Wilderness is a sub-designation, so it's inside the Gila National Forest. So the Gila National Forest is almost literally in my backyard. And then I have to, from where I live in Silver City, drive. I think the closest place to enter the Gila Wilderness proper is about 45 minutes for me. And going in a different direction, it's more like an hour. So it does require a little bit of work, a little bit of travel to get into the wilderness. But Silver City really is the primary gateway town. There are multiple other towns that surround the Gila Wilderness. And I might be a little biased since I live in Silver City, and I really love it. But, this town is a really close connection to the wilderness, and people that live here really try to get out there as much as possible.
Luke, take us back 100 years. None of us were around then, but there was a man named Aldo Leopold who was around. He's been recognized as an early conservation leader, and when he worked on the Gila National Forest in 1918, he wrote, quote, "When the pioneer hewed a path for progress through the American wilderness, there was bred into the American people the idea that civilization and forests were two mutually exclusive propositions. A stump was our symbol of progress." And then he went on to write, "We have since learned with some pains that extensive forests are not only compatible with civilization, but absolutely essential to its highest development." So Luke, tell us about the role Leopold had in the Gila Wilderness and his role in designating it as a wilderness area.
Yeah. Wow, that's an amazing quote. And thank you for reading that. He was a phenomenal writer. So Aldo Leopold was a forester. He was working for the United States Forest Service in the early part of the 20th century when that agency was still very new. So the U.S. Forest Service was only founded in 1905. And that was a time period marked by really dramatic and rapid change on the American landscape, particularly in the West. So the newly formed Forest Service, their approach to land management was really characterized by this heavy-handed approach by, introducing non-native fish to rivers and lakes, creating artificial lakes to improve fishing recreation. They were doing things like removing top predators like grizzly bears, which were native to the Gila but have since been extirpated. They were removing the Mexican gray wolf from the Gila, and they were building roads. And management of forests and management of public lands back then really meant kind of opening them up for human use, for human development, to really kind of maximize resource value. And Aldo Leopold had the foresight to think that if we manage all of our landscapes like this, then we would really be doing a disservice to future generations of Americans who wouldn't have the opportunity like he did to experience these vast tracts of undeveloped, roadless acres of public land. And when Aldo Leopold first came to the Southwest, he noted that there were, at that time, 6 large roadless areas of more than 500,000 acres. And he was quickly watching all of them disappear. He was watching a rapid road development program occurring in this region. And he saw the threat to the Gila coming from that as well. And he was really able to lead the charge in pressuring his supervisors at the Forest Service to create a bold, creative new form of management that would basically set land aside from development, that would set it aside from road building. And after a couple of years of pressuring his supervisors, a man named Frank Pooler, who was the regional forester at the time, he officially signed off on Leopold's plan to designate the world's first wilderness, meaning he was the world's first formally designated roadless area.
Yeah.
Wow.
So about more of that, what exactly this wilderness area means. When the U.S. Forest Service set aside this Gila Wilderness, 755,000 acres. It means no roads can be built on it, as you mentioned, no building on the land there, but it doesn't keep the public out entirely. Tell us, Luke, what else does it mean to have this official wilderness designation by the federal government?
That's a great question. And it's worth noting that meaning has changed a little bit over time. So when the Gila Wilderness was first designated in 1924, that was an administrative designation. So it was something that was handled internally by the United States Forest Service. And that came with its own special set of regulations and prohibitions. And then 40 years later, in 1964, that model of land management was formalized on the national level when the Wilderness Act of 1964 was established, establishing the National Wilderness Preservation System. And the Gila Wilderness was really the model for that, but there were some changes over time that were different from the administrative designation and the legal national system that we have in the National Wilderness Preservation System today. So moving forward to the National Wilderness Preservation System, those key prohibitions that we have today, there are technically 10, and I'm not sure if I can list them off the top of my head, but certainly no roads, no commercial enterprise, no mechanized travel, no motorized equipment, no landing of aircraft, no installations or structures or developments, but certainly wilderness is not meant to prohibit people from enjoying these landscapes and developing really strong connections with these landscapes. And in fact, that was one of the main reasons why Aldo Leopold was originally pressuring the Forest Service to establish this wilderness designation, was because he was afraid that we would lose the opportunity to experience solitude and true quiet and primitive recreation in vast, undeveloped tracts of land. So the way I like to think about it is instead of focusing on the prohibitions, we can really look at the wilderness system as enabling and preserving the opportunity to have a certain type of experience that we really would not be able to have anymore without these kinds of purposeful systems that preserve them.
I'm just thinking of it in a really simple way. It's like almost removing the industrialization of our society completely out of that being in that wilderness area.
Yeah. And something else I think that's worth mentioning. So I've heard you mention a couple of times that 755,000 acre number, and that was approximately the original size of the Gila Wilderness when it was first designated in 1924. But there's a saying in conservation that a wilderness battle is never won. And the Gila really bears that out. And unfortunately, it has really been one of the premier examples of that. So a mere 8 years after the Gila was first designated by the Forest Service, the North Star Road was put in, separating the Black Range from the rest of the Gila Wilderness, cutting that number down to about 500,000 acres, reducing the Gila Wilderness by about a third. And that was less than a decade after the Gila Wilderness was first established. And then in the 1950s, we would see the formalization of the road to the Gila Cliff Dwellings National Monument, which also went directly against the Forest Service's own mandate. And around that same time period, we'd see a couple other attempts to reduce the Gila Wilderness in size, for commercial timber harvest and other purposes that would have reduced the Gila by another several 100,000 acres. So, while it was a tremendous step forward, the administrative designation proved to have its own shortcomings and vulnerabilities. And it was those kinds of threats and continuous change following the administrative designation that really prompted the Wilderness Society and other groups to pursue the passage of the Wilderness Act to formalize these protections in federal law, rather than rely on administrative designations, which proved to be a little flimsy. So today, the Gila Wilderness is actually a bit more than 500,000 acres after all of that. And then we have the separate Aldo Leopold Wilderness in the Black Range.
Yeah. And yeah, I definitely want to get to some of those current threats as well. But I wanted to mention, going back to what you said earlier about it just being such a unique thing to have these preserved public lands. And I know that was a big draw, for us in New Mexico, for a lot of people living in New Mexico, actually. My dad and my husband are both hunters, and I know they've drawn some big game tags out there in the Gila. So, hunters have access to that wilderness. The landscape, as I understand, is shaped from like these millions years old volcanic eruptions, right? Tell us more about the ecosystem there, the terrain. You mentioned some of the animals, but what kind of other big game live out there?
Yeah, well, I'm a new hunter myself, and I hope to draw an elk tag one day in the Gila Wilderness. I've heard them referred to as the Gila monsters. They're pretty legendary, and the Gila is definitely prized throughout the state of New Mexico and beyond for its remarkable world-class hunting opportunities. The Gila is incredibly biodiverse. It is also home to the critically endangered Mexican gray wolf, which is the most genetically distinct and the most threatened of all of these subspecies of the gray wolf. The Mexican gray wolf was actually extirpated from the region in the early part of the 20th century, but fortunately, a few individuals remained, and there is a reintroduction program that began in 1998, 26 years ago, and today there are about 250 individual wolves in the Gila and beyond in the greater Gila ecosystem. And those wolves are a keystone species, and they manage the populations of elk and deer, and their effects kind of ripple and radiate throughout the ecosystem, and they're the foundation of ecosystem health. But they continue to remain very vulnerable, very threatened. And even though the population is increasing, unfortunately, the genetic diversity of that population has been decreasing over the years. And that's something that groups like New Mexico Wild and others are really focused on, is advocating for better management of that population. Another iconic species of the Gila would be the Gila trout, one of the rarest trout species in the world. The Gila trout, the exact extent of their range is not fully understood, but it's thought to encompass much of the Gila Basin, the Salt, and the Verde Basins over in Arizona. And unfortunately, due to habitat change and other pressures, the populations in Arizona were fully lost before they could be properly documented. And that entire species of trout only remained in the Gila in a few streams by the middle part of the 20th century. And there has been a very intensive and so far rather successful management and reintroduction campaign program for the Gila trout. And they now are in, I want to say, about a dozen streams, and they are a phenomenal species to go fishing for. You can fish for them. They're becoming a really popular and iconic sport fish. I actually just caught a few over the weekend.
Oh, nice.
And they're really tiny, but they're really beautiful. They're a little spooky. They're easy to scare off, and you have to hike in rather far to find them and fish in really tiny little water. But it's a great time. It's a great way to kind of connect in a really intimate way with this really unique ecosystem. There are more than 300 species of bird that can be found in the Gila throughout the year. And there is a huge diversity of forest type, thinking of plant species. So I'm not sure how much I should go into all the details here, but for instance, let's just talk about ponderosa pine forests. They are fire-adapted trees, and there are very few really representative ponderosa pine forests left in the United States because of the effects of fire suppression over the last century. And the Gila Wilderness has one of the best records of fire management, of allowing natural fire regimes to occur. And therefore, in the center of the Gila Wilderness, we have one of the most representative, healthiest ponderosa pine forests left in the country. And that's extremely rare. That's very special. And that's just something that wilderness provides the space for, is allowing these kind of natural disturbance regimes to occur. And then another forest type we have down the opposite end of the spectrum is we have a flood-adapted forest type of the cottonwood bosques. And the cottonwood forest along the Gila River as it exits the wilderness is arguably the most representative and healthiest remaining intact cottonwood bosque forest left in the Southwest, because it experiences a natural flood regime. So I could just go on and on and on about the Gila, which is so unique. It's so special. You could pick any number of things, any one thing that would set it apart. But fortunately, the Gila has, just dozens of individual features and unique species that just make it really, really special.
Yeah,
awesome.
It's fascinating to hear you describe those, because it really just kind of reminds me of like going back in time, into a place where humanity hadn't really reshaped the landscape so extensively. And those are obviously places are becoming increasingly rare, whether it's in the U.S. or in other parts of the world. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, speaking of kind of going back in time, way before we were here, there were people who lived in natural caves in the Gila. We talked a little bit about this earlier in the episode, but understand, as you described as well, soft volcanic cliffs. These were used to create homes and really communities. A community that is now designated as the Gila Cliff Dwellings National Monument. Can you tell us a little bit more about this monument and what makes it just so unique?
Yeah, the Gila Cliff Dwellings National Monument is a very accessible and really special place to visit. So as I mentioned earlier, there is a road that goes all the way up there from town, Highway 15. And there's a really short hike that takes you up to these remarkable structures left in this massive alcove up in the cliffs that people lived in. This would have been what archaeologists refer to as the Mogollon culture. And they were there through, I think, approximately the year 1300. And a lot of the structures that they left behind remain intact. And the one at the monument is perhaps the premier example of one of these kinds of structures. And you can hike right up to it. You can actually walk basically right into and through the Gila Cliff Dwellings. And it really transports you back in time. It's there's something really, really powerful, really special, knowing that people lived here and this was their home. And it wasn't just a place for them to vacation, but this was their homeland. I always take friends and family there when people come visit, and it's just it's special every time. It gets me every time. Now, I recommend that anybody in the area go visit it.
Wow. So the Forest Service and local environmental groups still work to protect the land out there. And I know you've been adamant about continued protections, right? Like keeping the Gila River from being dammed, for example. What sorts of threats do you foresee in the future for the Gila, and what sort of protections would you like to see moving forward?
Thank you for that question, and that's a great question. Like I said earlier, there's that saying that a wilderness battle is never won. I think with the centennial of the Gila Wilderness, we have this dual obligation to really honor and celebrate the successful and monumental conservation work of the past that enabled us to continue to enjoy the Gila today. But at the same time, we need to remember that what we really are celebrating is the fact that people had foresight and they had the courage and the humility to stand up and say that we need to react to and respond to the new threats of our time to adequately protect this remarkable landscape into the future. So 100 years ago, in the time of Aldo Leopold, one of those primary threats was that of road building. Over the last century, a lot has changed. And one of those changes since the time of Aldo Leopold is that we have seen the height of the dam building era in this country. In New Mexico alone has over 400 major dams. And that actually leaves the Gila River, whose headwaters are at the heart of the world's first wilderness. It leaves the Gila River as the only remaining undammed main stem river in the entire state of New Mexico. But believe it or not, we almost didn't have any free-flowing rivers in New Mexico because there have been several attempts. There have been actually 4 really significant attempts to dam the Gila River since the 1960s. Now, fortunately, all of those attempts have failed because of the community outrage that they engendered and because of the success of community organizers in standing up to prevent those threats, to prevent the loss of the last free-flowing river in the state. But because of that history, we also know that it's not a matter of if, but when there is going to be another attempt to dam the Gila. So from my perspective, from the perspective of the community in Silver City and the other communities that surround the Gila, from the perspective of many of the conservation groups that work in this area, the primary threat right now to the Gila region, to the Gila Wilderness, remains the threat of a dam on the Gila River. And we do have a tool at our disposal to permanently prevent a dam on the Gila River, and that is something called a wild and scenic designation. So that is a federal law akin to a wilderness designation. So just like a wilderness designation has to go through Congress, and then it's permanent, and it enshrines all these protections that we were just talking about for wilderness, including preventing any road building. A wild and scenic designation responds to the threat of dams, and it permanently prevents a dam on a free-flowing river. And because of that, it's actually really considered the highest form of protection that any river can ever have. And it, prevents us from having to play defense, every decade or so, every time there's a new threat of a dam. And the free-flowing Gila River is really the heart of this ecosystem. It really is the reason why this area is so special. It is the lifeblood of this region, and its loss would just be catastrophic, not only to the communities that enjoy recreating in the Gila and that have those personal relationships with the Gila, but it would be devastating to the ecosystem. And if we are successful, then we will have this designation for the Gila, and we will have something to celebrate 100 years from now.
So the dam, would I imagine, make a consistent flow of water through the Gila River, permanently changing the ecosystem. And just to sort of flesh that out, why is it so important to keep that river from getting a dam? What would happen if a dam went there? Just to explain it in sort of simple terms there.
Any number of things could happen, and it really depends on the type of dam that's put on the Gila. But these ecosystems are dependent on free-flowing water, and they are adapted to free-flowing water. They are flood adapted. So, for example, we have the cottonwood forests that line the Gila River, and that type of tree, a Populus fremonti, really requires seasonal flooding in order for it to successfully propagate and germinate. And then that tree is really a keystone species that countless other native species depend on. And even a small dam that didn't create a giant reservoir but impacted the natural flood regime could give invasive species such as tamarisk a huge advantage, and could really, really be detrimental to the health of that cottonwood forest. And therefore, we could lose tons of biodiversity and ecosystem health and function in the Gila, and every other desert river in the Southwest is choked by invasives and is no longer free flowing, and they require highly intensive restoration in order to keep whatever modicum of ecosystem health we can get at this point. The reason why the Gila is the most representative, most intact cottonwood forest in the Southwest is because it's free flowing. So that's just kind of a concrete example of what would happen to the ecosystem. But then we also think of, what, the cultural loss would be. People have been coming to the Gila to recreate for generations. People come here to fish. People come here to camp. People come here to hunt. People come here to just get away for a little while. And the reason why people love the Gila so much is because it has that special wild feel, because it's not an artificial reservoir, because it's not an artificial lake, because it is an authentic wild experience. And we don't have a lot of opportunity to experience that anymore in 2024. Like I said, there's only one wild river left, truly wild river left in the state. And if we lose that, I think we're going to really be impoverished as a state, and we're going to be impoverished as a community. And that's something that we can never get back. There have been proposals in the Gila before that would have backed a reservoir up from the confluence of Turkey Creek, which is really close to where the Gila exits the wilderness, all the way up to Sapio, where the Sapio River comes into the Gila, which is, I want to say it's about half of the Gila River in the wilderness would have turned into a giant reservoir had that been successful. And there have been other boondoggles as well. There have been many attempts to dam the Gila, and all of them would have had catastrophic effects on the region.
Luke, is there anything that we're missing that you want the public to better understand about the Gila or any other wilderness for that matter?
The most important thing to know is that we get to have the Gila Wilderness. We get to have these remarkable, well-protected ecosystems because people stood up to protect them. These types of places, these wild forests, these wild rivers, these wild animals, they don't really exist by accident anymore. And if we want to preserve them for future generations, then we have to come together and we have to fight for them. We have to stand up for them. And there are opportunities to do that. There are opportunities to ensure that we have a wild Gila River for the future. There are opportunities to ensure that we have a Gila Wilderness in the future. And I think people should know that because of this grassroots movement to protect the Gila and regions like it, we've been very successful so far, but we still have a lot of work to do. So right now, the campaign to permanently protect the Gila River is in a really, really great spot, but the fight is not over just yet. So the bill that would designate the Gila River as wild and scenic is in both houses of Congress, and it has passed out of committee in the Senate on a bipartisan basis. And that's because of the tremendous amount of support that it has on the ground. And if we want things to continue to progress and move through Congress, then we need to always make it clear to our representatives that this is our priority. And if we continue to do that, then the bill will pass and the Gila will be permanently protected.
You mentioned solitude. You mentioned fishing out there, wanting to get into hunting. But just to ask you, what is your favorite thing to do in the Gila, if you can rank one?
Wow, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
I think my favorite thing to do is backpack and get as deep into the wilderness as I can and turn up a drainage or a canyon that I've never been up before and just see what's up there. And that feeling of exploration, that feeling of discovery, that feeling of total self-sufficiency is just so incredibly empowering. And it's really something that it's almost sacred, the feeling you get when you're deep inside a wilderness area. And then that's what empowers me to do the work I do as a grassroots organizer.
Luke, thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for talking to me. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Again, a big thanks to Luke Koenig, a Gila Grassroots Organizer for New Mexico Wild. I was just very impressed, as hopefully you were as well, listening to just that encyclopedic knowledge that he has of the Gila and all of what has happened there over the last 100 years as it's been. It's truly just amazing to hear all of the different history that's tied in with that, and we appreciate Luke's expertise.
Yeah, and like he said, it's a really special place here in New Mexico, and it takes people who really care about it, like he clearly does, to make sure that they're speaking out, when someone wants to, let's build a road here, or let's build a dam. So we appreciate this conversation. If you guys have any story ideas for future episodes or somebody you'd like to hear from on our podcast, always feel free to reach out. I'm Gabrielle.Burkhart@krqe.com via email, and gburknm on social media.
I'm at Chris McKee TV, and also Chris.McKee@krqe.com. Thanks for listening.